that situation under GDPR, even seeing somebody else's data that you shouldn't see is considered a breach.
So you need to have that control in place, and you need to know who is authorised to see it and who isn't authorised to see it. Metadata is really important, and actually metadata solves a lot of problems here. If you're able to store with every record that relates to a data subject who owns the record, because it might not just be their name, it could be other data around them. So you need to know who is the data subject for that particular piece of data. Where did we get the record? When did we get it? The lawful basis that we retain it is essential to be stored with it. How long do we retain it, if we have any retention rules to go with that? The classification of the data, is it a special category or is it something else?
And of course, do we actually send it to anybody at all? Is that data going out to payroll? Is it going out to a third party for any particular reason? You have to be aware of that because you have to tell the data subject. You have to be as transparent as possible in your privacy notice to tell them that their data is potentially going outside your organisation, but that you have put the right processes in place to make sure those third parties are not going to do something they shouldn't with their data.
And making sure it's the right amount of data. Are we collecting the data we need, not more, not less? Are we sharing the right amount of data? This is the kind of precision that is required to work well with GDPR, the precision to know what every record is, what it does, who owns it. That's an essential part of this. And as Tash said earlier, it's not about trying to achieve that in the next couple of weeks, because that's not realistic. But it is putting these strategies in place, and it is actually driving it forward. The GDPR isn't going to go away and be brushed under the carpet in 2 years when everyone forgets about it. That's not how it's likely to roll out.
If there's one thing I would say to get sorted now, it's going to be your record of processing. Know what you hold. You know, what is it, where did it come from, and all that other information around it, because once you've put that in place, you can then look at data and say, are we actually holding more data than we need to? And that's something you're not allowed to do. Personally, I can't wait for this one, because my local gym, every time I sign up for a gym class, they want to know my job title. And it drives me mad. You know, so I'm actually really looking forward to the point where I can say, you don't need to know my job title for this. And they hopefully will have come to that realization by doing their own record of processing. They will look at it and say, we hold this. Why do we hold it? We have no lawful basis for holding that. Therefore, we need to delete it.
And that will that also goes into that back to your system logs. You store IP addresses. You store other pieces of data that relate to these things. So yeah, you definitely need to know why you've got it and what it's there for. If we look at some of the tools that you could implement to address some of these, suppression list management. Now you may have a suppression list of all the people who have said, don't keep my data, don't contact me again. But if that suppression list is misused, you've then got a data breach. So you may want to think about how you have a one-way encryption on the suppression list. So even if it was shared without intent and someone tried to misuse it, they couldn't actually use that list. But you can still encrypt your email addresses before you send them to measure the encryption against the suppression list.
While we're talking about encryption, there's the other things to consider as well, which is the anonymization and the pseudonymization. Now, under GDPR, they're quite clear on anonymization, because if something is genuinely anonymized, it doesn't fall under GDPR because it doesn't identify an individual. However, to be completely anonymized, there has to be no reversal possibility. Under the old Data Protection Act, it was a little bit lighter, and you could say it, but it's really, really difficult to do, and you'd get away with it. But now under GDPR, it's like, no, if anyone can reverse it, it's not anonymized, it's pseudonymized. And pseudonymized data is still personal data and comes under GDPR, but anonymized data doesn't. Sorry, carry on.
Perfect. Okay, so there's all sorts of other tools that are quite useful to do with breach notification. What happens if you realise that some data has been mislaid, a laptop was left on a train, and you need to tell the people who are affected by that. You need a process for doing that, an automated process with some workflow to manage that breach accurately in a timely fashion is really important.
And again, that comes down to your record of processing, because if you know where the data is and how it's being held and what the security is around it, you may or may not need to report it to the ICO or the regulator. So if you lose a laptop on a train but it's encrypted, you probably don't need to report it to the regulator. If you lose it on the train and it's not encrypted, you probably do. If you lose it on a train and it had a database on it of special data or HR data or something like that, you not only will have to inform your own data privacy person, your regulator, but also the data subject. So unless you know that information in your record of processing, no system in the world is going to be able to help you with this. So you've got to know it, put it in the system with the metadata, and then use it.
And these are the situations where these are unique to every company. There's broad rules, broad guidance, but every organisation needs to understand their own risks, how they work. Do they have people going out with data on laptops, and what do they need to do about it? What kind of data is it? So it's the ultimate GDPR configuration is unique to each business, but along the lines of the guidance and the various different tools. The tools themselves are, if you have these processes, the tools should be able to fit any organisation. It's all about how you use them and when you need to use them. Storing things like objection management, so people have objected to certain kind of processing. You need to make sure you've recorded that and you know what you're going to do, how that data is going to not go through the standard processes. Data portability. Now that's an important tool because there's some debate as to exactly how far that's going to go. You certainly need to be able to take your data out of the system in an open standard that allows someone else to do it, but I think Tash has got a further view on that.
Yeah, so this isn't a case of just the data subject being able to download it and pass it to another system. It's you being able to pass it to another system. So we've seen this already with the banking industry, where open banking, which has taken years to put in, is where data can be transferred between banks. If you say, I want to switch banks from A to B, they can now do it. They can send data from one bank to the other in a format that can be read and understood by the others. Utilities, obviously, that's going to be, so important when people want to switch providers. They don't want to wait 3 weeks to do it. They want you to just seamlessly move them across to the other provider with no delay. And that's one of the requirements of the GDPR. How that works for smaller companies and smaller providers is yet to be seen in practice. And most of GDPR is like that. We don't know until someone does it wrong and we have case law established as to how we genuinely should be doing it. But there are guidelines that we can follow.
And there's other complexities to do with backups. There's questions about exactly how much data you would take from a backup. How's that backup stored? Is it secure anyway? Lots of details, and I think some of this will come down to case law as to what the ultimate situation is.
Yeah, particularly with the right to erasure, because if you have had to erase something from your system, but it's sitting in 5 years' worth of backups in a warehouse, what do? The law says you should get rid of it. You need to find a way to remove it from backups. The slightly more pragmatic approach, and I'm not a lawyer, which is why I can say this, is that maybe you need to start thinking about, well, what's the risk? Well, the risk is that someone complains because you restored a backup, which then meant they were no longer erased. So actually what you probably need in place is the ability to make sure you don't accidentally restore something that should have been erased. So there are different ways. Everything is a risk-based approach, and you've got to work out for yourself how much risk you're willing to take versus the cost of being perfectly compliant. And no one is ever going to be perfectly compliant, nobody at all.
And even simply data subjects handling.
Yeah.
Data subject access request handling, those are tools, you certainly need those tools, that's very straightforward. And also looking at linking to external data, knowing when recording when data has been sent elsewhere so that you can audit what you've sent, what you've shared. Now, I think we have a question which Claire is going to ask.
Yes, hi, Stuart, thanks very much. We have a question which has come in from Barry, who's actually wanting to know what about sharing customer energy usage data anonymously to third parties? Obviously, one of the things that utilities are seeing an opportunity with is the ability to offer new services and new opportunities for their customers. But in order to do that, they do have to share some of that energy usage data. So what are the implications for them on that side?
Okay, I'll take that. So the key word in that question is anonymous. If it truly is anonymous, it's fine. Okay, but if it's not anonymous, it's just pseudonymized, so somebody can work out who it is, then in that case, you need to be very careful. You need to make sure the subject knows that you're going to transfer it and why you're going to transfer it. And then the company that you've transferred it to will have obligations to let the data subject know that they have the data. So you've got to make sure that you genuinely do anonymize it.
Okay, so I hope that helps the listener who asked that question. GDPR is a good thing, and it definitely can enable or even force more effective business, and it definitely helps increase confidence in the digital economy. So overall, it's a good thing. Think through compliance into operation. It's not an event. The 25th is not a day where then it's done. That is just the start of a perpetual journey of managing compliance. It's not just a one-off.
It's going to be like health and safety. When that first came out, everyone was like, oh my goodness, how are we going to cope with this? But in reality, however many years down the line we are now, we're all used to it. It's part of our living, breathing, everyday life. And that's what GDPR has to become. You know, it absolutely has to become something that we do just as business as usual. And yes, it's quite a hike now to get everything in order, but it should just continue. It's just going to be a long-term evolution.
Yes, digital security is essential. If you are unable to manage your digital security, I say digital security, physical security equally. If you have a filing cabinet and your data is records are taken from there, that's equal. But digital security is a weakness. I think it's a lot less understood than the physicalities of securing a building. There's a lot of organisations who acquire devices, add them to the network, and don't really think if that security camera has opened up a hole in the firewall, these things happen. So it's really important to be digitally secure.
Yeah, so I think we need to wrap up because we need some time for questions. So if you had one last thing to say on GDPR, what would it be?
Well, I would say that it has a cost, but it brings opportunity.
Okay.
I would agree with that. But yeah, you need to think strategically. Ideally, you have the opportunity to join up your systems and simplify, make things as simple as they can. Don't have data that you don't need. I think actually understand your business. That's the key thing. If you know what your business does, you'll have a better business anyway.
Yeah, I've seen so many companies who are saying, I've got this data from 15 years ago, I don't even use it, it's just taking up space. Can I delete it? It's like, well, of course, if you've got no reason to hold it, delete it, otherwise it's a breach.
Yeah, the data is actually a tangible asset now. It's not about the 15p it costs you to store it in the cloud. It's about the liability that having that data holds. And you have to treat it like a tangible asset, like it was a machine that needs servicing or anything else, that's an electrical device that needs testing every so often. It is a tangible asset. It has a liability to exist. It has real cost to keep.
Yeah. And I think if I were to sum it up, I would say, as we said at the beginning, whatever you're doing with GDPR, do the right thing. If you wouldn't want it done to your grandmother or your child's data, don't do it. If you even have to question it, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And as someone said very recently to me, if you used to do it in the 80s, you almost definitely shouldn't be doing it now.
If you are part of a big multinational, is the parent company allowed to share data within the group?
The general guidance with GDPR is you're actually allowed to do most things as long as you can justify it and you have the right technical and operational measures in place. So, for example, if your head office is based within Europe, or within the EEA, as long as you're telling the data subject that you're transferring it and you have a necessity to transfer it that you can back up, you have a lawful reason for doing it, then you can do it. If you're transferring it outside the EEA, that's when it can start to get difficult. So in situations like this, it might be that you need to transfer it to the US. We don't have an adequacy agreement with the US, so you can't easily. What you have to do is either make sure the company or organisation you're sending it to is on Privacy Shield, or you will have to have a contract in place with them yourself, the EU clauses, model clauses, to make sure that they are going to abide by the GDPR when you do transfer it. So it's very much like you can do most things, but justify it and have those operational and technical capabilities in place.
So one of the questions that I have that also relates to, I guess, data storage is really about what are the implications around cloud storage?
So whenever you put data in the cloud, you are potentially transferring it to a processor. So most cloud providers will be considered processors because they are looking after the data on your behalf. You're deciding when it's going to be deleted, what's going to happen to it, and so on. But GDPR wasn't really written with the cloud in mind. You know, it wasn't necessarily written by people who really understand the real world. So there are lots of things about it where we're still trying to work out how it applies, and the cloud is one of them. Because a processor is supposed to have a record of everybody that is a controller that they work with, what the data is that they're processing, what the purpose is. They're supposed to have all this information so that they are fully aware of what they're processing. Now, that's not possible in the cloud. When you've got a cloud that's been segmented up into millions and millions of places with millions and millions of different controllers, how can they possibly know what's in the cloud? So cloud computing and GDPR are a very, very grey area. But from the perspective of a corporate using a cloud provider, you must have a contract in place with them as a processor. In most cases, the big cloud companies will have pushed down a data processing agreement to the controllers, so you will probably have one already, and it's a very, very generic one.
So some of the risks here with cloud providers also is that sometimes you find it's a resale market. The person who is selling you the service isn't necessarily the provider, and if their upstream provider has a problem, a technical problem, which exposes your data, as the controller, that then comes to you. Even if you could say, or one might argue it was outside your control, if you chose that supplier, then it's fully within your control. And so you potentially have contingent liabilities that you don't have sight of. So you certainly have to think very carefully. Back to what Tash said earlier, go and have a look, certainly talk to the people. If your supplier isn't someone you can ring up and talk to and build a relationship with, you probably need to look for other suppliers who give you that level of service, that allow you to see what they're doing, allow you to understand their own network topology, so you can make an informed decision as to whether that's a risk that you're willing to take against the cost. Because, of course, cloud has a cost. If it's lower cost than local processing, then you can consider it. But considering the GDPR liability, you may actually think that the cost of processing locally is less than the liability of sending your data somewhere else.
Of course, that cloud as well may be based in a country where we don't have adequacy agreements. So if it's based in the US, is that cloud provider on Privacy Shield? If it's based in China and you didn't realise, you are sending data outside the EEA and you shouldn't. Absolutely. And that's really scary.
If the GDPR has a reach outside of the EU, does that mean that a data protection officer needs to be appointed for subsidiary companies, including those outside of the EU?
Okay, so firstly, not every company needs a data protection officer. You know, there is an entire workflow that you go through to see whether or not you need one. But absolutely everybody needs a data protection lead or champion or something, but just not necessarily a DPO. A DPO is a designated title where there is special protection for that person and things like that. If you do need a DPO, then you can have one group DPO. The important thing is that they have the right experience and qualification to do the job, that they understand everything that happens in all your subsidiaries, they understand the individual local laws and GDPR, they are available if needed for any of the regulatory authorities to talk to them. So in that case, you're potentially looking at someone who doesn't exist, you know, who is multilingual, knows everything around the world, doesn't ever sleep. So in reality, it might be that you choose to have one person backed up by a team around the world who all have various responsibility. Or you can outsource it to data protection as a service. And again, you have to choose your provider very carefully, but you've got to look at all these different things and see what best suits your business.
Could I ask you to elaborate just a little bit on the concept of data protection as a service?
Yeah, so data protection as a service is basically you're outsourcing your DPO responsibilities. So if you are a company where you need to have a DPO, but you don't have anybody who can fulfill the criteria, and it is fairly strict criteria, one of which being that you can't have a conflict of interest. So you can't give that role to someone who works in HR, for example, because they're handling lots of personal data, or a member of the board who has a vested interest possibly in not following GDPR. So in circumstances like that, you might want to outsource it to a law firm or to a specialist DPO firm or something like that, where you will have a designated person or team that you pay on an annual retainer who will be the person that represents you to the regulatory authorities that make sure that you are complying with everything you need to comply with on your own risk-based approach, and that you are doing what you should be doing. And that person, by the way, any DPO or any data protection lead, whoever they are, is not personally responsible. That's quite important. The responsibility lies with the entity, which is the controller, or the entity that is the processor, or both.
I imagine that, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I imagine that using the data protection as a service could be quite an expensive process for a company, or is it still less expensive than having a designated person within the company?
In all honesty, no one knows yet. Everything's still finding its feet. I think that people are still getting their head around GDPR, and at the moment people seem to be taking on their own DPOs, which are fairly expensive because they're very highly qualified people. If you outsource it, I suspect it's going to be a slightly cheaper service, but it remains to be seen what happens to the marketplace there. It's going to be a supply and demand thing. There are not going to be many people that know GDPR inside out and understand your own business inside out, so it is going to be very difficult.
What impact is there on sole traders who publicly list their personal details, which are also their business details? How much protection do they get from a GDPR perspective?
Well, if they've published their details, then they've done that with an intent. I guess it depends on what other people then choose to do with the information that's been published.
Yeah, so it's completely dependent on what somebody is doing with it. You know, if that information is posted, for example, on a closed forum that you need a password to get into, and someone is scraping that and then selling it on mailing lists, then that's absolutely no. You know, there's protection there. There's actually a couple of things that fall in here when you start talking about sole proprietors. For the sake of GDPR, they are considered entities. GDPR absolutely applies to them, the data they hold and everything else. Other regulations which are very, very close to GDPR, like PECA, the Electronic Communication Regulation, considers them to be an individual person, so they have much more protection. So people cannot email a sole proprietor, for example, unless they're an existing customer, soft opt-in, or if they have given their explicit consent. So there is slightly more protection for sole proprietors on other laws, but the requirement to be GDPR compliant still exists for sole proprietors.
Okay, thank you. One of the questions that's come in, and this is a follow-up question from Ross, is he's asking, would interaction with, say, a newsletter, if you've received an unsolicited newsletter and you click on a link within that newsletter, would that be considered or interpreted as a tacit opt-in, or would you still need specific, I want to receive this newsletter kind of opt-in instead?
Again, this is going to be a combination thing of a number of different laws, but under GDPR, consent must be expressly, affirmatively given. So it must be, I am ticking in, I know exactly what I'm agreeing to, you've told me precisely what you're going to do with my data, you didn't offer me an incentive for ticking it, you didn't bundle it up with terms and conditions, you made it really, really clear, so I'm absolutely saying, yes, I want to opt in. Now remember, that's going to be for when you need consent. There are going to be other situations where you can market to individuals where under GDPR you can hold the data under a legitimate interest, because it's legitimate for you to hold information to market to people who might be interested in your goods and services. And if they are a business, then under the PECA regulation, you can absolutely email them. You don't need their consent, as long as you identify who you are and you give them the ability to opt out. So it's always going to be a combination of laws. It's going to be slightly different in other countries, but you potentially have a legitimate interest under GDPR to hold information for marketing purposes. How you then execute that marketing could fall under different laws.
Okay, so for companies that make their bread and butter through marketing services or opportunities, this GDPR is not going to be the death of business as they know it. They're still going to have the opportunity to continue working as long as they can prove that there is a legitimate reason that they are, A, reaching out to that person, and B, holding their business data, not necessarily their private data. Am I correct?
So if they're reaching out to them in a business capacity and it's basically a B2B communication, then yeah, that's going to be fine. What it's going to weed out is the people that are doing things they shouldn't be doing. So they generally do not have a legitimate interest in holding data, because I'm really, really not interested in Viagra, for example. That's not legitimate. I'm not interested in that, and I'm not interested in that, so you don't have a legitimate reason for holding it. So whenever you have legitimate interest down as your lawful basis for holding data, you have to have a balancing test that sits alongside it, where you've actually sat there and argued with someone, with one of you playing the role of the data subject and one of you being the company, and saying, is this really legitimate, or am I abusing your rights as an individual? And you have to argue it out and document it to show that it truly is a legitimate interest. And at any point, the data subject can object. It's their right to object, to say this is not legitimate, and at the point they object, you also have to stop processing it until you can prove that it's legitimate interest.
So this goes back to the importance of metadata, to be able to record that is why we have that data. So as long as we can justify that, we can audit it. It means that we can defend it should we need to later. But the overall concept, I think I mentioned this last time around, I would propose, is the principle of least surprise. Is that person going to be surprised? If they're surprised, they're more likely to complain. If you work within looking through their eyes and saying, are they going to welcome this? Is this what they expected me to do? Then you're far closer to doing the right thing and behaving well and not putting yourself at risk. What
impact do you both perceive GDPR having on the smart metering business?
It's going to be an interesting one. From my perspective, I think there are targets in place for companies to put smart meters in as quickly as possible, and that worries me that data protection by design may not be factored in properly. So GDPR may impact that, the inability to hit targets on time, because you're going to have to make sure that you are building data privacy in everything that you do. Is that data going to be able to be read by stood outside the front door with some smart piece of equipment? You don't want it to be. So there are going to have to be a lot more security considerations put in, and that might slow things down slightly on the rollout.
And the cost of operating is definitely going to be impacted, because from a security point of view, cybersecurity is quite weak in a lot of the home automation systems. If they're connecting to the metering or mobile devices, that brings extra risk in there. So there's certainly going to be a greater cost of the development of these items to make sure that there isn't a cybersecurity risk, as well as the handling of that data, whether the people reading the meters would instead use a portal rather than anything else to real-time enter data from one system into the other, rather than collecting data and storing it on their own devices. Those are the kind of tools that really should be in place to make sure that the risks are lower. Unfortunately, driven by competition, it may well be that the people who take greater risks are going to operate at a lower cost to drive the price down, and until somebody then gets caught out by making a mistake or not having adequate provision in place, that's the point of time that gets exposed. So it's just be careful of having a race to the bottom, because that squeezes the value out and creates risks.
And one data breach is going to be all it takes, and that could potentially bring a company down. Yeah. On the flip side, it's going to be great for consumers, because they're actually going to have trust in them, because they're going to know that you designed privacy in there. They're going to believe that, that data is not going anywhere it shouldn't be. It's not being sold the minute it leaves your front door. Your house is secure because even though they can look at your behavioural patterns, it's not going to be used in a way it shouldn't be used. So for the consumer, it's going to be a really, really good thing.
I think that's an excellent closing remark. It's all about trust all the way through. Consumers need trust. They need to trust their providers. At the minute, there's a lot of distrust with devices, IoT, and technology at many levels. So I think trust is got to be the focus, and that will generate loyalty. It will generate better customers and more long-term relationships.